Welcome back to Department 1. All jurors and alternates have returned. Mr. Durst is present with his lawyers, Mr. Chesnoff and Mr. DeGuerin. We have, and Chip Lewis is present also. For Mr. Durst, we have Mr. Miata, Mr. Henderson, Mr. Milius. Welcome back. Mr. Balian and Mr. Lewin.
Your Honor, may be excused.
You may be excused, yes. And Mr. Lewin, you may resume your cross-examination of the defendant.
Thank you, Your Honor. Mr. Durst, do you recall that last Thursday, the last time we were in court, I asked you about whether you would want to live with Susan Berman? Do you recall that?
Yes.
Do you recall when I brought the issue up later, you denied having said in your answer to my original question, you denied having said that you would not like to live with Susan Berman. Is that correct?
I don't recall either of them. But in terms of living with Susan Berman, we never intended to live in the same apartment. We just intended to live in a building with two apartments. She would be in one and I would be in the other.
But obviously she would be right underneath you and you would be having very likely continued interaction with her, correct?
If I said I did not want to live with Susan Berman, I was referring to living in the same apartment with Susan Berman.
But
I had no problem and I would enjoy living in a townhouse in which she had one floor and I had two floors.
Mr. Durst, would you agree that your response when I brought the issue up a second time was to deny ever having said that you would not like to live with Susan Berman, correct? That's what you did.
I don't remember doing that, but if I did that, I was saying I did not want to live in the same apartment with Susan Berman.
Same apartment or same building?
I do not want to live in the same apartment with Susan Berman. I would enjoy living in the same building with Susan Berman.
RD 797-82621.
This will be People's 327, transcript 327.
Yes.
I'm asking you, you're not just choosing as your friend, you're basically, according to your testimony, she's going to live right in the same building right below you. You'll have Susie Berman 24/7.
I wouldn't like to live in the same building as Susan Berman.
Mr. Durst, didn't you just say that, no, my point was I wouldn't want to live in the same apartment, but I'm happy living in the same building? That's what you just testified to, correct?
Correct.
That's not what you said 4 days ago, correct?
I misspoke.
You would agree, Mr. Durst, there have been a lot of times in this trial when you say something, I then put up a clip that says something directly different out of your own mouth, and your response has been, I misspoke, correct?
No.
Sustained. Stricken.
Last week, you also testified that you were very certain that you arrived at Susan Berman's house at 10 a.m., correct?
Approximately 10 a.m., correct.
And, Mr. Durst, at the time you testified that when you arrived, the front door was locked, you waited roughly 5 minutes, and then you unlocked the door before making entry into the house. Is that correct?
Correct.
You indicated when you walked in, you saw the 3 dogs inside, correct?
I saw 2 dogs, yes.
And you eventually go to the backyard, but you said the dogs stay in the house and they don't follow you to the backyard, correct?
I don't know if I said that. I don't know what the dogs did.
Well, I want you to assume for a moment, Mr. Durst, that in fact you said that the dogs must have stayed in the house because they did not come into the backyard, and you saw either no dog nor any human being in the backyard. I want you to assume that for a second. I want to ask you, does that refresh your recollection of what you said?
I said I did not see them in the backyard.
Mr. Durst, while you were in the backyard, you further testified that you heard the sound of a horn honking from the front, and you unlatched the back gate, opened it, relatched the gate, and went to the front again. Is that correct?
Correct.
And you also testified that after you walked back to the front door, again for the second time, that's when you saw the note that you believed had been taped to the door was missing. Is that right?
Correct.
And then you re-entered the house for the second time. Is that correct?
Correct.
You further testified that as you walked back into the house, the dogs were still inside, correct?
I saw some dogs inside, correct.
And you have further testified that when you left the house for the final time, that the front door was closed, correct?
I'm pretty sure I closed the front door behind me.
And, Mr. Durst, you're familiar, you were present for the testimony of Susan's neighbors and the police that when they all responded that the front door was locked and that the police couldn't even make entry into the house through the front door. Do you recall that?
Yes,
Do you further recall, Mr. Durst, that Dr. Marvin Karp, Susan's immediate neighbor, testified that on December 23rd, 2000, around 9 or 9:30 a.m., he saw two of Susan Berman's dogs running loose around his front yard, correct?
I don't recall, but I don't deny he said that.
So, Mr. Durst, would you further agree that Dr. Karp testified that one of the dogs ran actually across the street, busy Benedict Canyon, which had a lot of traffic, which caused him concern when he saw it, correct?
I don't recall him saying one dog ran across the street.
But again, you're not disputing that he said that, is that correct?
No, I don't dispute that he might have said that.
And you are aware, Mr. Durst, that at the time of Susan's murder, at the time you went into the house, she had 3 dogs, correct?
She had 3 dogs, correct.
Can you explain then how it is that between 9 and 9:30, the dogs are allegedly walking around the neighborhood, but when you arrive at 10 a.m., they had managed to get back inside a locked and secured house? Can you explain that?
They are mistaken, saying 9 to 9:30. It must have been after 10 o'clock.
So you would agree, you're not going to testify that Lulu or one of the other dogs had another set of keys and maybe she opened the door to get back inside like Morris, are you?
That's argumentative. I will sustain the continuing objection.
Withdraw, Mr. Durst. You would agree that these are very small dogs and that they're not going to be able to jump over the fence to get into the backyard, correct?
I guess it depends how tall the fence is.
What's that?
I guess it would depend on how tall the fence is.
Well, Mr. Durst, you were there. You opened and closed the gate to the fence. You would agree that that fence is way too tall for old, small dogs like Susan's to be jumping over the fence, correct?
Correct.
And you would also agree, Mr. Durst, that obviously Susan Berman has that fence so that the dogs don't have access to the street, correct?
Correct.
And knowing Susan as you do, the way she cared for her dogs, that if those dogs had the ability to get past that fence, she wouldn't be allowing them in the backyard, period, correct?
Speculation, objection.
Overruled.
Correct.
So, Mr. Durst, can you explain how those dogs would have gotten back into the house if Dr. Karp's observations that two of them are walking around between 9 and 9:30 outside, and your observations that at least two of them are inside a locked and secured house when you enter after 10? Can you explain that?
They could have gone in the front door. I said I found the front door open when I went back to the front door the second time.
But Mr. Durst, when you went back to the, so your position is that these dogs who were in the house when you entered the first time, correct? They couldn't have been out, is that right? They were inside the
I
first time,
saw two dogs, correct.
okay? And now you're saying that you've agreed you latched the back door, the back fence, so they couldn't have got out the back gate because it was locked when you got there or closed when you got there, and then you closed it when you left, correct? Let me rephrase the question, I'll withdraw it. You testified that when you opened the back gate was closed, you unlatched it, went through it, closed it again, correct?
Correct,
So you would agree they could not have gotten out that gate because it's secured, correct?
correct.
And then you say you go around to the front and you don't see any dogs running around. And it's your testimony now that the dogs went out the front door and then somehow came back in after you were in the house for you to see them a second time? Is that your testimony?
No, I think not.
Well, so can you explain how it is that these dogs who are inside of the house both times when you go in, both times, Mr. Durst, when the house is locked and secure, they don't have access to get out, how is it they get back inside? Can you explain it?
I said the second time that I approached the front door, I saw the front door open and the note was gone.
But Mr. Durst, when you went inside the house, you also said the dogs were still inside. You saw them again.
I saw the dogs inside when I walked to the kitchen and out the back door.
Mr. Durst, when you re-entered the second time, you testified those dogs were still in the house, correct?
I saw two dogs in the house when I went in the second time.
So, Mr. Durst, if two of the houses were in the house the second time,
Two of the dogs are in the house.
I'm sorry,
Two of the dogs are in the
yes,
house.
sorry, two of the dogs were in the house the second time, then they couldn't have been loose running around outside, correct?
They could have gone,
Overruled.
they could have gone out the front door.
When would they have gone out the front door?
When I entered the house for a second time,
But you testified, Mr. Durst, that when you enter the house for the second time, you end up seeing at least two of the dogs inside. That's been your testimony. So how does that work?
they walked in the open door.
So they
Just
walked,
like I did.
so they walked out and you missed them walking out. And then they managed to get back inside without you knowing it so that you can see them when you see Susan's body. Is that your testimony?
Yeah,
Does that make sense to you?
Sustained.
Mr. Durst, can you explain how reasonably that scenario could have possibly happened?
I just did explain how it could
Sustained.
have happened.
Can you reasonably explain how that situation occurred?
Sustained.
Under argumentative, Your Honor?
Hold on. How that could explain how that possibly could have happened. Argumentative. Yeah, sustained.
All right, Mr. Durst, you also testified that Susan used the word staycation to describe what you guys are going to be doing, correct?
Correct.
Mr. Durst, are you aware of when the word staycation even became generally used in the normal lexicon?
No idea.
Mr. Durst, if I were to have you assume that that term staycation was not used in 2000, would you be able to have an explanation as to how Susan Berman would have been using a term that no one was using yet?
I'm going to sustain it. He's testifying now. He's characterizing what you said. I don't think it was a quote.
No, he just, He just said it was a quote. I just asked him directly, is that the word she used? He said yes.
All right, go ahead.
But the premise, what I'm objecting to.
Okay, hold on.
Evidence
You
of-
would assume the term staycation was not used in 2000. Well, okay. We're assuming it. Go ahead.
Okay, Mr. Durst, can you explain if the word staycation was not being used at the time Susan Berman disappeared? I'm sorry, Susan Berman was murdered. Can you explain how it is that she was using that word? Do you have an explanation?
That's my objection, the assumption that it
Well-
was not being used.
I think it's common understanding, but do you have are you willing to prove that?
Sure, we can have the court take judicial, I mean,
No, I'm not going to take judicial notice, but you can prove it otherwise.
I can have me calling another witness, but I'm happy to do it.
Okay, we're not going to argue about it now. I'm going to overrule the objection, subject to a motion to strike.
Maybe Susan was ahead of her time.
Okay. So, I now, Mr. Durst, I want to talk about back to Galveston. You previously testified under oath in Galveston that your entry into the apartment, and I'm talking about on the day that Morris was killed, and the shooting happened at about 6:15 in the morning. Is that correct?
Did you say 6:50 or 6:15?
No, 6:15 in the morning.
That's correct.
However, during your direct examination at this trial, that is not what you testified to, was it?
I don't remember what I testified to.
RD 765, this is from last Thursday, August 16, 2021.
August 16th was 2 weeks ago. People's
Oh, I'm sorry, yeah.
328A.
328, 328A.
This is during your direct examination, my mistake. Thank you, Mr. Henderson.
On the day that Morris Black met his death, what did you do that morning?
I got up, I drove to this Jewish synagogue, which is about a mile from the apartment.
That's in Galveston.
Yeah,
And what did you do there?
I jogged to the apartment.
How long did it take you to get to the apartment?
10 minutes, maybe.
And what time of the morning was it when you got to the apartment?
Probably 8 or 9 o'clock.
Mr. Durst, do you agree that those two statements, both made under oath, cannot both be true?
I would agree.
What's that?
I would agree.
Mr. Durst, you would also agree that you're not going to forget the time that you got to your apartment on the morning where you're going to suffer the most traumatic incident of your life, seeing your friend die in front of you in an accidental / self-defense shooting, correct?
As I said here, it was 6:15.
Well, Mr. Durst, you would agree you either lying under oath in Galveston when you said 6:15 or lying under oath on August 16th when you said it was 8 or 9, correct? They can't both be true.
When I said 8 or 9, I misspoke.
And it's your position, Mr. Durst, that your misspeaking was just a issue with your memory recollection, is that correct?
Correct.
Mr. Durst, would you agree that an alternative explanation could be that you just can't keep track of all your lies?
Excuse me, that's argument.
Sustained.
All right, when you entered the apartment, Mr. Durst, and I'm talking about on September 28th in Galveston, what direction was Morris Black facing?
He was sitting at the round table, facing the front of the apartment where the television was.
And you testified at Galveston, correct, that he was basically sitting at the table, and that means facing you when you walked in the door, correct? Is that correct?
More facing straight ahead. The door would have been off to his right.
Right, but you were able to see his face, correct?
Correct.
And that's why you said that he appeared to be angry at you, correct?
Correct.
And you had previously testified that you immediately went into the kitchen to make sure the gun was still in the broiler, correct?
Correct.
What made you do that?
Because he was not supposed to be in the apartment. And I was worried that he might have gotten the gun.
But why would you believe that he's going to be sitting at the table with a gun? What prompted you to believe that?
I don't know if I believed he had the gun or not. I knew that if the gun was where I had left it, then he did not have it.
When you saw his face, what did his face look like?
He looked like he was angry at me.
Do you have any idea why he would have been angry at you?
No.
So, what's the next thing that happened? After you go to the kitchen, you find out the gun is not there, what's the next thing that happens?
I said, Morris, where's the gun?
Did Morris take any steps towards you?
Your Honor, this line of questioning is repetition.
What rep?
With the court, trying to-
That's a speaking objection.
Overruled.
Did Morris take any steps towards you?
Morris reached under his yellow jacket, pulled out the gun, and swiveled towards me, taking steps.
In fact, Mr. Durst, you testified on August 26, 2021, that he took 1 or 2 steps towards you, correct?
I don't remember the testimony, but that sounds right.
And you would agree that you were very clear in your cross-examination testimony that he took these steps towards you because you repeated it a second time. Is that correct?
I said, Morris, where's the gun?
All right, let's play first RD 805 and then immediately after that RD 807. These are both from August 26, 2021.
We'll mark these as 329, 329A, and then 330, 330A.
Yes.
Yes, I was looking in the drawer for a gun. The gun was not there. I said, Morris, give me the gun. I stood up. He took 1 or 2 steps towards me. I put my right hand up. He was holding the gun the way you hold a gun to shoot it.
Does that refresh your memory that you said that he took 1 or 2 steps towards you?
Sure.
807, please.
He was pointing the gun at me.
Did he say anything?
No, he said nothing.
Do you have any idea what prompted him? You've said so far, all you've said to him is, Morris, where is the gun, right?
That's what I recall. Morris, where is the gun?
And he's gotten up and he's now coming towards you with this firearm, correct?
Correct.
So you testified a second time. This time you didn't say how many steps, but you agreed that Morris was advancing towards you with the firearm, correct?
Correct.
Is that what you testified to at Galveston, Mr. Durst?
I I don't recall what I testified to in Galveston.
You would agree, Mr. Durst, that again, this is a memory that is imprinted in your mind of what happened with Morris and the gun, correct?
No, I don't see it like that at all. As a matter of fact, Dr. Robson said those kinds of memories, when I say her name wrong, the
Loftus.
psychology lady.
We know who
Isn't
you're
she
talking
Dr.
about.
Robson?
Loftus.
Laughlin?
Dr. Loftus.
Loftus.
I think she said that when you have these very difficult occurrences, your memory of them tends to change over time.
She also testified, Mr. Durst, if you recall, that a very significant image like this, that the studies show that people have much better recollection because the memories are so important. Do you agree?
Well, if she said that, she said that. I don't know.
So, would you agree, Mr. Durst, that in your testimony in Galveston, you never mentioned Morris Black ever taking any step towards you, correct?
No, I do not agree.
Well, the animation video, which you previously been shown and testified to, do you recall that, the defense animation video?
I do.
That's an animation video, correct, that was done. That video was based on your description, is that correct?
The animation video was rejected by the court because they did not like the way I was explaining what I had said to the person who produced it.
Can you show the defense animation video, but only from the 13 to 16 second mark, please?
Your Honor, this will be People's 199A.
199A?
Yes.
I'm just gonna play it from beginning and stop it at 16 seconds.
No, okay, all right. No, Mr. Ethan, can you do me a favor? Please start it at, don't start at the beginning. Please start it, that's fine, you can start it right there,
It's at 8 seconds.
okay? Would you agree, Mr. Durst, that that video does not show Morris Black taking steps towards you, correct?
I do not agree. Video shows him taking steps towards me.
You believe that that video demonstrates Morris Black advancing towards you. Is that your testimony?
Yes,
Now, you've also testified a moment ago that the animation was somehow ordered by the court. Is that your testimony? I think that's what you just said a moment ago.
no, just the opposite. The court refused to let the defense play the animation testimony.
Isn't it true that you were asked by Mr. DeGuerin during your direct examination on October 23rd, 2003, page 95, lines 19 through 23, question, and does the video animation that you have seen duplicate exactly what happened as you recall it and as you experienced it? Answer, yes, sir. That's what you said, correct?
That is what I said, but Judge Susan Chris,
Motion to strike, the rest is non-responsive.
Stricken?
Mr. Durst?
Judge Susan.
Nope. There's no question pending. You've answered. Next question. You were then asked, and by this computer animation, does it duplicate as nearly as is possible with technology as we have it today exactly what happened? And you responded, yes, sir. That's on October 23rd, 2003, page 96, lines 2 through 5. That's what you said, correct?
That is what I said, but Judge
Motion to
Susan
strike
Chris-
as the rest is non-responsive.
Stricken, you may simply publish the inconsistent statement, Mr. Lewin, without making it a question.
Well, okay, I understand, Your Honor. On the same date, page 96, lines 10 through 13, you were asked the following: is the struggle that you and Morris Black had over the gun an accurate depiction in the video animation? And you responded, yes, sir. That's what you said, correct?
That's what I said.
Okay,
but
let's
it was rejected.
motion to strike. The rest is non-responsive.
Stricken.
The judge would not allow them
Motion to
play
strike.
the
There's
animation.
no pending question, Mr. Durst.
Okay.
I am answering the question.
I'll strike it.
Thank you, Your Honor. Can you please show the entire animation video now, please? I want you to watch the entire video, Mr. Durst. Mr. Durst, isn't it correct that you testified multiple times that you grabbed the gun with your right hand from the top, placing your right hand over the barrel in Morris Black's hand? That's what you've testified to, is that correct?
Correct.
Mr. Durst, you would agree that's not what this video shows, is it?
No. I think the video shows me putting my hand on top of Morris Black's hand on top of the gun.
Mr. Durst, isn't it true that the animation shows you grabbing the gun with your right hand from underneath the weapon?
Excuse me.
Overruled.
I put my hand on top of the gun.
Can you
When
please...
he fell down, I let go of the gun.
Can you please go to the section? I want you to watch, Mr. Durst. It's going to be very slow. Watch. If you can you just move it along? Now let's see. Mr. Durst, stop. Is that grabbing the gun from on top as you testified, or are you grabbing from underneath?
Yes.
You're grabbing from underneath, correct?
No, not correct.
In this animation, are you telling the jury that you are not grabbing the gun from underneath rather than on top of the gun?
I am telling this jury that I grabbed the top of the gun over Morris Black's hand. And this animation does not show that clearly.
Well, it's
Will
not...
you describe
Sure.
for the record what the video shows at this
Yes.
moment?
The video shows Mr. Durst's right hand on top of Morris's right hand, but Morris's right hand is underneath the gun. Mr. Durst then puts his hand over Morris's hand. Both are underneath the gun. There is no hand on top of the gun.
And Your Honor,
Yes? I'm sorry, Mr. DeGuerin?
Incorrect. 352.
and Your Honor,
Overruled, it was correct. Yes? Mr.
one
Miller?
additional thing, it's an
Yes.
18-second video, and it's at 15 seconds, the point that we've described.
Thank you. I accept the prosecutor's characterization of the what we are seeing at this moment rather than Mr. DeGuerin's.
Mr. Durst, I'm not asking you what happened. I'm asking you, isn't it true that this animation, which you said was absolutely accurate during your testimony in Galveston, that it definitively shows that you are grabbing the gun underneath the weapon when you testified under oath that you grabbed it from on top? Isn't that correct?
It does not definitively look like that to me.
Explain, Mr. Durst, how in this image does it show you grabbing the top of the gun as you testified under oath to?
Overruled.
I don't think it's clear that I was grabbing the top of the gun, but it is equally unclear that I grabbed the bottom of the gun.
So you think, looking at this picture, Mr. Durst, it is unclear that you and Morris's hands are underneath the gun rather than on top of them? Is that your testimony, looking at this picture?
That is definitely my testimony. Both of our hands are on top of the gun.
In this picture, both of your hands are on top of the gun.
That's correct, in this picture.
Okay, I will move on. You would agree, Mr. Durst, that an issue that you had in your testimony at Galveston was, even though this animation gave a scenario which was consistent with your theory, when you testified, you were unable to stay consistent with your own evidence that you were submitting. Would you agree?
No,
So you believe that your description of what happened in Galveston under oath is consistent with the defense animation?
correct.
All right, let's move on. During the struggle, before the gun went off, you and Morris fell to the ground. Is that correct?
We fell. I don't know that we hit the ground before the gun went off or after the gun went off.
And can you explain what it was that caused you and Morris to fall to the ground?
Morris tripped over a leg from the office chair.
And so he tripped on a leg of the chair, is that correct?
Correct.
RD 784, 81621.
People's 331, 331A, Your Honor.
Yes.
With my right hand, I grabbed the gun on top of his hand, and with my left hand, I grabbed his shoulder,
Which shoulder?
his right shoulder.
As somewhat as Mr. Chesnoff and I did here.
Yes,
And as you did that, what happened?
we fell down.
Do you know why you fell down?
I think he tripped on the leg from the table.
Mr. Durst, you have testified, depending on your version, that he tripped from the leg of the table or that he tripped on the chair leg. You agree those are not the same thing, correct?
I misspoke when I said leg from the table.
In fact, Mr. Durst, isn't it true that as you sit here telling this story of what happened, you're having difficulty remembering what prior versions of the same story you've given, correct?
No,
Overruled.
You do agree that under oath in Galveston, you were very clear that he had tripped over the chair leg, not the table leg, correct?
correct.
And would you agree that your description of somebody tripping and falling to the ground during a struggle, that sounds remarkably similar to how you have alleged Peter Schwartz fell and injured himself, correct?
No, not correct.
Remarkably, I think makes it argumentative.
Okay.
You may re-ask the question,
Sure.
rephrase it.
Would you agree, Mr. Durst, that your description of how Morris Black fell to the ground is very similar to the story you gave as to how Peter Schwartz had fallen to the ground and hurt himself?
Still argumentative.
Overruled.
I would say that two situations have no similarity and numerous differences.
Please play RD 783.
People's 332, 332A.
Thank you.
And then you said, quote, he might have hit his face on my foot, unquote. Can you describe what you meant by that?
The two of us fell down on the floor. Kathy had gone to Greece the previous summer, and we had bought a Greek rug called a flocati, Flokati. The flocati is about 2 inches thick, and it was about 4 by 5 feet wide. It flew out from underneath our feet, and we both fell down. He hit his face on something, probably the coffee table, maybe my foot. I was wearing cowboy boots.
Would you agree, Mr. Durst, that in both of those situations, you are alleging that a person you were struggling with tripped and fell to the floor, that in Peter Schwartz's case, that's how he was injured, and in Morris Black's case, a gun goes off and he ends up being killed. Is that correct?
That's an argument it is.
Overruled?
No, completely different. Peter Schwartz, rug, moved, causing us both to fall to the ground. Morris Black, there was no rug to move.
Right. One is a rug and one is a chair leg or table leg, but you would agree that in both scenarios you are alleging that the person you were struggling with tripped and fell to the ground, correct?
Correct.
Let's talk about how the gun actually went off. Can you describe, based on your memory, what happened that made the gun actually discharge?
When the two of us fell into the kitchen, I felt a sharp pain in my elbow, and I heard the gun go off at just about the same time.
And do you know how it was, Mr. Durst, that the gun ended up firing? In other words, was somebody's finger on the trigger?
Morris's finger was on the trigger.
You agree the gun's not going to fire unless somebody depresses the trigger, correct?
Pistol. It was a pistol. Pistols come with safeties. If the safety is not engaged, pistols have a way of going off when a sudden shock occurs.
So it's your testimony that your Ruger 22 can fire even without somebody pulling the trigger. Is that your testimony?
Correct.
Sister, during your testimony in Galveston, isn't it true that in demonstrating what happened during this alleged struggle, that you placed your hand over the ejection port of this semi-automatic pistol and said that it was in that position when the gun discharged?
When I fell on my elbow in the kitchen, I heard the gun go off, and I must have released the gun at the same time.
Now, my question is, Mr. Durst, you testified in Galveston. In demonstrating it, you had your hand blocking the ejection port of the firearm, correct?
While I was holding the gun.
Isn't it true, in fact, Mr. Durst, that on cross-examination, you were actually asked about this by the prosecutor? Is that correct?
Yes.
Question. This is on page 177, lines 15 through 22. If your hand is in the way, it's not going out the ejection port, is it? And you agree by it, the prosecutor is referring that the casing cannot eject out the ejection port if your hand is blocking the exit point, correct? That's what he's asking you, is that right?
While my hand was on the gun, it was over the ejection port. But as I said, the gun went off about the same time, and I released the gun.
So my question to you, Mr. Durst, you would agree that if you have a hand blocking the ejection port of that Ruger 22, if you're blocking the ejection port, the casing can't exit, correct?
If you're holding it tightly enough, the casing could not be ejected.
And you're aware that if that happens, you're going to get a jam in the firearm, correct?
I don't know that.
So the question was, if your hand is in the way, it's not going out the ejection port, is it? Answer, when I move my hand, it's going to eject. It's not going to stay in there. Question, well, it would get jammed in there, wouldn't it? Answer, I don't know that it would be jammed in there. The slide would go back. I don't know what would happen, or what did happen. Is that your testimony?
Yeah,
Now, Mr. Durst, are you testifying right now that, given your experience with firearms, you do not understand what would happen if a casing can't eject out of a semi-automatic firearm? In other words, you're saying, I don't know. Is that your testimony?
yeah,
Mr. Durst, isn't it true that you are well aware that if the casing can't eject, it's got nowhere to go, it's going to jam the firearm, correct?
I'm not aware that will always cause a jam.
Mr. Durst, you started off by saying, I don't know what would happen, correct? In your response that I just read to you. Can you put that up? I want you to look at line
22 to 23.
22 to 23, Mr. Durst. Do you see that?
Yeah, I say it will be jammed in there.
No, well, what you also said is, you said, I don't know what would happen, You used the word would instead of did. Why did you use the word would instead of did?
Argumentative, objective form.
Overruled.
Don't recall.
Mr. Durst, would you agree that the normal kind of English language definition of you saying what would happen implies, Mr. Durst, that you are not talking about a situation that actually happened. You are speculating about what would happen. Isn't that correct?
Objection, argumentative.
Overruled.
I was answering the question, what would happen?
No, Mr. Durst, you were not asking anything about what would happen. You were being asked questions about what did happen. Isn't it correct? The prosecutor was asking you about what happened when your hand was in the way over the ejection port, and that you changed from what did happen to making an argument of what would happen, correct? That's what you did.
Same argument in 353.
Overruled.
Is that what I did? I thought I was testifying as to what happened.
And then, Mr. Durst, isn't it true that you said what would happen twice and then realized, uh-oh, I better change that to what did happen, because now it sounds like I am talking about a fictional event that did not occur. Isn't that what happened, Mr. Durst?
Objection, argumentative.
Sustained.
Mr. Durst, can you explain why it was you first said what would happen twice and then changed it to what did happen?
I don't think I see a distinction between what would happen and what did happen.
If you don't see a distinction, Mr. Durst, then why did you correct yourself in the middle of the sentence?
Objection, argumentative.
Overruled.
352.
Overruled.
Maybe I saw a distinction then. I don't see a distinction now.
All right. Would you call yourself remorseful after Morris Black's killing?
I don't think I was remorseful, no.
Well, can you describe how you felt then if you weren't remorseful about the accidental death of your friend?
Objection. Relevant.
Overruled.
In the days after Morris died, I made an effort not to think about what had happened.
Mr. Durst, you were asked by Andrew Jarecki on December 13, 2010 about how you felt when the killing happened. Do you recall that?
No,
Do you believe, Mr. Durst, that if you would have been asked, that you would have expressed any sorrow or sympathy for Morris Black?
that would have been 10 years later. I think I did feel remorseful and sympathy, but not in the first days and weeks after it happened.
When you were talking to Andrew Jarecki in 2010, isn't it correct that when you were being asked, how did you feel about what happened, you made it all about you, correct?
Objection. Argumentative.
Foundational to impeachment, Your Honor.
Okay, overruled.
I made it all about me. I don't understand that.
So you're being asked how you feel about what happened with respect to sympathy or feelings about Morris. And isn't it true that your response was to not talk about anything about Morris, but to talk about how his killing affected you, correct?
Objection. Argumentative.
Overruled.
I would have to see the question. That
RD,
is how I felt. It was much more about me than it was about Morris.
RD 478, December 13, 2010, page 732, lines 2 through 5.
This is from People's Q69 on the transcript, page 112.
And how did you feel when that happened?
I shocked, amazed, overwhelmed, astonished. My elbow hurt. Scared.
Mr. Durst, did you mention anything about Morris at all in that clip?
I don't see the question.
The question was,
Question. Wasn't a question. How do you feel?
how did you feel when that happened?
What's your objection?
352.
Overruled.
I answered, how do I feel?
Mr.
Whatever I just said, shocked, amazed. That's how I felt.
Well, Mr. Durst, wouldn't you have also felt, oh my God, I've killed my friend, he's dead, this is horrible. Something about Morris at all? Anything?
Argumentative.
Overruled.
I did what I said, I was very aware of the effect on me, much less aware of the effect on Morris. I think I did start feeling, or letting myself feel remorse.
When was that?
Sympathy. After it had completely sunk in, years after Morris died.
Well, this is 2010, Mr. Durst, and would you agree that in answering that question, you did not add anything relating to any feelings or even mention of Morris at all, correct?
The question was, how did I feel? Correct.
And Mr. Durst, in this clip that was just played, did you notice when you were describing what happened, which elbow you grabbed to indicate that it hit the ground?
When Morris and are you changing the subject?
No. I just played that clip for you. In that clip, you were describing what happened, and you said, shocked, amazed, overwhelmed, astonished, my elbow hurt, scared. I'm asking you, which elbow did you grab, indicating that it hit the ground and hurt?
My left elbow.
Please play
landed
it.
in the kitchen.
Please play it again.
And how did you feel when that happened?
I shocked, amazed, overwhelmed, astonished. My elbow hurt. Scared.
You just reached over and grabbed your right elbow, correct?
I don't see that.
Pardon? Overruled.
Mr. Durst, the defense animation, what elbow does it show hitting the ground?
I don't know.
Play it again, please.
99A.
You just play the end. Well, it's fine. That's your left elbow hitting the ground, is that correct, Mr. Durst?
Correct.
Well, that's not what you indicated in the statement to Mr. Jarecki when you grabbed your right elbow, correct?
Jack, I'm not looking at Jack.
Overruled.
I did not see in the split you played of Andrew Jarecki where I said which elbow hit the ground.
Mr. Durst, isn't it correct in describing you reached over with your left hand and you grabbed your right elbow? Is that correct?
No.
All right. Did you intentionally shoot Morris Black in self-defense, or was the discharge of the gun an accident?
It was in self-defense.
Mr. Durst, do you understand that there is a difference between intentionally shooting somebody in self-defense versus being in a struggle and the gun going off accidentally? Do you understand the difference between the two?
Yes.
And it's your testimony that you intentionally shot him in self-defense then, is that correct?
My testimony is not that I intentionally did anything whatsoever. Everything that occurred because I was defending myself, and Morris accidentally got shot.
Okay, so then a moment ago, I just want to clarify. So you are saying that although I was defending myself, the actual shot being fired was not intentional. That shot happened accidentally. Is that correct?
Correct.
You have spent numerous hours reviewing, analyzing, and even testifying about your activities after the shooting. Is that correct?
Compound.
Overruled.
Seems to me that's several questions. I spent hours preparing for my testimony in gallery. I don't know about reviewing and analyzing.
Mr. Durst, you testified at length about everything that happened after the shooting. Is that correct?
I testified at length about the dismemberment.
Mr. Durst, isn't it correct? You basically said in Galveston you didn't remember anything about the dismemberment, but you did testify at length about what you did immediately after the shooting and then going forward for several days, correct?
Several days, yes.
And you understood how important it was to remember, recollect, and try to document everything that had happened, correct?
Correct.
And I would assume that the time immediately after the shooting, that those were some of the scariest moments of your life, correct?
Correct.
And is it fair to say that you were very upset about what had just happened, correct?
Correct.
And you were not really thinking straight because you were almost like in a fog, is that correct?
Correct.
And when you did kind of snap out of it, out of the fog, is it fair to say that now you're in a panic?
I wouldn't describe it as a panic.
Well, isn't it fair to say, Mr. Durst, that you were so upset that it was even difficult to put coherent thoughts together?
I don't know what you mean. I put thoughts together.
Is it fair to say that the killing resulted in a pretty bloody crime scene, correct?
No.
No? Mr. Durst, even in the animation video, they have spatter going on to the wall in the animation video, is that correct?
I would not call what the video shows pretty bloody crime scene.
Well, Mr. Durst, forgetting what the video showed, you were there. He's been shot in the head. Would you agree it is a pretty bloody crime scene?
Are you asking me what I remember happening, or are you asking me what the video showed?
No, what do you remember happening?
It was not a pretty bloody crime scene.
Was it bloodier than the crime scene with Susan?
Objection, argument.
Just a moment. Was it bloodier than the crime scene with Susan? Overruled.
It was bloodier than what I remember seeing in Susan Berman's house.
Was it bloodier than the crime scene with Kathy?
Oh, come on. Objection, 352.
350.
Overruled.
I'm not aware that there was a crime scene with Kathy.
So, Mr. Durst, it's your testimony that you're basically almost on top of Morris when the gun goes off, correct?
Correct.
And you actually have your hand on the gun itself, correct?
Well, I release the gun when the gun goes off. Whether my hand came off the gun before the gun went off or after, I don't know.
And you agree that you had blood on your face, correct?
I had blood on my hand.
Did you have blood on your face or no?
I had blood on my face from my hands.
Wait, so you're saying you had no blood on your face from this shooting to Morris Black's head going off as you're basically on top of him? You had no blood on your face at all? Is that your testimony?
My testimony is that after Morris, I became aware that Morris died. I sat down for half an hour on my bed to try to figure out what to do. And while I was doing that, I must have put my hands on my face.
And you're saying that's where the blood came
When
from?
I finished deciding to go for a walk, I went into the bathroom to wash my hands. And I could see in the bathroom window that I had blood on my face. I believe it came from my hand.
I'm gonna read to you from your trial 102703, page 88, lines 16 through 24. You answer, I do remember blood being on my face. Question, and you think that came from where? Answer, I think that came from when I shook him and tried to get him, when I came back and shook him and put my hand over his nose and over his mouth to see if he was breathing. And then I put my head down in my hands while I was sitting on the bed. That's where I think it came from. But it could have come from someplace else. Was that your testimony?
Yes,
Mr. Durst, is it your testimony that you are shaking Morris Black? You are right there trying to see, you've got your head down, and you're trying to figure out, you've got your hand over his nose and his mouth, you're shaking him trying to see if he's breathing, and you're saying you didn't get any blood on you from that?
I might have, I don't know.
Well, how can you be shaking a man who has suffered a gunshot wound and is spewing blood? Does that make sense?
Pardon me?
Argumentative.
Overruled?
Yes,
You also got blood on your clothes, correct?
I don't recall getting blood on my clothes.
In fact, that's what you testified to, is that correct? In Galveston, you said you did not believe you had any blood on your clothes, is that correct?
I don't recall what I testified to,
Does it make
but
sense?
I don't recall that I had blood on my clothes.
Does it make sense to you, Mr. Durst, that you could have somebody suffering a gunshot wound to his head, spewing blood, that gets maybe on your face, certainly on your hands, but just nothing gets on your clothes? Does that make sense to you?
Objection, argumentative. It was queuing.
Okay, just a moment. This makes sense. So, sustain.
I would not describe
Hold on.
what happened
Sustained, the objection
as
was sustained.
oozing
Judge, I
blood.
don't believe he can hear you when you say that, I'm sorry.
He has it on his screen in front of him that I have sustained the objection.
Mr. Durst, do you agree that when Morris Black was shot in the head, that he was spewing blood?
No, he was not spewing blood.
How much blood was coming from him at the time that he was shot? Do you recall?
His head was in a puddle of blood.
So no spewing of blood at all, is that your testimony?
Not to my knowledge.
Misters, how come immediately after the shooting you did not use your cell phone to call 911?
I did not have my cell phone with me. It was in the car.
Why did you leave your cell phone in the car?
I was going to go for a job, and in those days, or at least the cell phone that I had in those days, was a big clunky cell phone.
And can you estimate the size? What cell phone did you have? How big was your cell phone?
You asked me the manufacturer.
No, I'm just asking how big the phone was that you had.
It was the size of cell phones.
I'm going to hold up, Mr. Durst. This is an iPhone 8.
Much, much bigger than that.
Much, much bigger than that.
Much
Shall I mark that, Mr. Litton?
If you take it home, Your Honor, you'll never sleep. It never stops ringing.
I don't take exhibits home. We lock them up.
We have the court judicially recognize an iPhone 8 is certainly not in existence when this happened.
Right.
Correct.
So, Your Honor, I'm going to mark the following. This is a Nokia 6160 phone.
Wait, where'd you get that?
Wait a minute.
Oh, I bought it.
Objective testimony.
Well, it's been stipulated to in stipulation 66
Okay, so
that,
six.
that
Okay.
Mr. Durst used a Nokia 6160 cell phone.
Display it to council.
I've never seen it before. I don't need to look at it.
Okay, well,
I don't need to look at it.
whether you need to or not, it is the obligation of counsel to present exhibits to opposing counsel so that they may be examined. He has presented it to you. You've declined.
Mr. Durst, this is an iPhone 8. This is the Nokia 6160 cell phone that you indicated you stipulated to that was in your possession. This was the phone you had, not this exact phone, but this model. You've stipulated to it at the time you were in Galveston.
Please be seated, Mr. Lewin.
Does this look like a big, clunky cell phone to you, Mr. Durst?
It is big and clunky compared to the iPhone.
Well, let's see. You would agree, Mr. Durst, it's not as tall as the cell phone, as the iPhone. It's not as wide as the cell phone, as the iPhone, correct?
It's the depth that I'm talking about.
The depth. And it's your testimony that this phone was too big for you to put in your pocket and jog with. Is that correct?
I chose to leave it in the car
Mr.
and
You would
not put it in my pocket when I went for my job.
Well, Mr. Durst, would you agree, though, that this is not a big and clunky cell phone, especially for the times, correct?
It's definitely big and clunky compared to the iPhone.
Not what I asked you. Back in 2001, when you had this phone, you would agree this was not a big and clunky phone. This was a very small phone, correct?
I think there were bigger phones.
And Mr. Durst, would you agree that not having your cell phone with you is the same thing that you said with respect to Susan Berman, correct?
Correct.
In other words, Mr. Durst, you've been involved now in either admittedly being present when somebody dies from your gun, Morris Black, or discovering somebody, either they're breathing cold air on you or they're already dead, but you found a second person, Susan Berman, dead. And in both of the situations, you have said that the reason you could not call 911 was because you did not have your cell phone with you. Is that correct?
The statement you made is incorrect. I did not say that Susan was breathing when I found her.
Mr. Durst, you in fact said that you felt her cold breath.
I said I felt her cold face.
Objection.
I'll allow the question and answer to stand. You could renew the hypothetical without the disputed fact.
Mr. Durst, do you agree that in both instances, as an explanation for why you did not call 911, you claim that either you left your cell phone on the plane with respect to Susan, or with Morris Black, you left your big, clunky cell phone in the car. Is that correct?
Correct.
And would you agree, Mr. Durst, that that is a convenient explanation to explain why you didn't have a cell phone with you to call 911?
Objection argumented.
Overruled.
I'm stating the facts. Whether it was convenient or not, I have no idea.
Your Honor, this phone was marked, correct?
Equals 333, Your Honor. You're not going to get that.
That one I don't need back.
333.
Mr. Durst, when you testified on direct examination, did you give a complete recitation of everything that happened after the shooting?
No,
What did you leave out?
I left out all kinds of stuff.
Well, as you sit here right now, can you let this jury know what specifically you remember, what detail that you left out?
Objection. Following question.
Well, it's that is asked and answered.
Which particular detail he left out?
You're talking about Susan Berman's?
No. No.
Then I will. Then I'll overrule the objection.
So we're talking, just so it's clear, Mr. Durst, we're talking about your recitation of what happened in Galveston. So my question to you is, did you give a complete recitation of everything that happened after the shooting, to the best of your knowledge?
I'm sure I did not give a complete recitation. of everything that happened.
Isn't it true, Mr. Durst, that you have previously stated on numerous occasions, including while under oath in Galveston, that the first thing you did after leaving the apartment after Morris was shot was you ran up the stairs and you knocked on the door to the D. Henriquez's apartment, correct?
First thing I did,
After you left the apartment was you went upstairs to the D. Henriquez's apartment and you were knocking on the door, correct?
I think the first thing I did was run down the block to the payphone on the corner and attempt to call 911.
Mr. Durst, do you recall testifying in Galveston that you ran upstairs and you pounded on the D. Henriquez's door very loudly?
Yes, but I believe that was after I ran to the corner and tried to call 911 on the payphone.
Well, Mr. Durst, why would you run all the way to the corner to try to call 911 when Morris is in an emergency situation and someone is right upstairs? Why would you run down the block first instead of banging on the neighbor's door?
The lady upstairs spoke zero English.
And Mr. Durst, but either way, can you tell me where in your direct examination you mentioned anything about ever going upstairs to the D. Henriquez's? You forgot that, didn't you?
Objection, comment,
It's not.
argument.
I know I testified in Galveston that I went to the corner to use the payphone. And when I came back, I went upstairs.
So my question, Mr. Durst, is where in your direct examination, in this case, in this trial, did you testify that you went upstairs and knocked on the D. Henriquez's door?
Well, your previous question was, did I testify to everything that happened during my direct examination? And I said I did not testify to everything that happened.
Well, Mr. Durst, why was it that during your direct examination with Mr. DeGuerin, you did not testify to going upstairs and banging on the D. Henriquez's door?
Well, I just answered your previous question that there were many things I did not testify about during my direct examination.
And Mr. Durst, you would agree that you did testify about going up to D. Henriquez's door in detail, both on direct and cross-examination in Galveston, is that correct?
Correct, that's my recollection.
And would you agree, Mr. Durst, that upstairs where the D. Henriquez's lived, it was, again, a very small apartment, correct?
Correct.
And you are aware that Ms. D. Henriquez has testified in this case through stipulation that she was home with her daughter and that no one came up the stairs and no one knocked on her door, correct?
No, I don't recall either of Enriquez testifying in this trial.
And can you explain, Mr. Durst, how she certainly testified in the Galveston trial as well, correct?
She testified through a, whatever the word is,
Interpreter?
a translator.
Well, that would mean she testified, correct?
Correct.
And she testified that she was home with her daughter and that no one came up the stairs and no one knocked on her door, correct?
I don't think she testified to that in Galveston.
And Mr. Durst, can you explain how Mrs. D. Henriquez could have missed you running up the stairs and pounding on her door?
Assume the fact that you improper hypothetical.
What rule?
Maybe she was in the bathroom.
Now, you don't dispute Mrs. De Henriquez's statement that she heard first and then saw you opening and slamming your door repeatedly, do you? That happened, correct?
She testified to that.
And are you denying that that happened?
I'm not denying that it happened. I am denying that I stood there and opened and slammed the door shut numerous times.
That's what she testified to, though, correct?
That's what she said, correct.
And you said as follows, correct? Galveston Trial 102303, page 122, lines 9 through 15. I think I must have been slamming the door for a little while. And then Mrs. De Henriquez says something, or I heard Mrs. De Henriquez coming down the stairs, and I stepped outside. She speaks Spanish, and she was speaking to me in Spanish. That's what you testified to, correct?
Well, I don't know what a little while was.
Well, those were your words, though, right?
A little while is my word.
So what did you mean by that?
I just said I don't know what little while means.
Well, you agree little while in that context would imply that you were opening and slamming the door more than once, correct?
Correct.
And can you explain why you would have been opening and slamming your door more than once?
No, it makes no sense. And I would be opening and slamming the door after Morris was shot. I was lying in the kitchen, dead with a bullet from my gun. I mean, slamming the door would attract somebody's attention.
Mr. Durst, could it be that the reason you did it was you were trying to make whoever was in the apartment think that the sound they heard was not a gunshot, but in fact, the noise of you opening and slamming your door?
Argumentative, speculative.
Overruled.
No.
And in fact, Mr. Durst, didn't you testify in Galveston that the problem was that you were having an issue with your door because of the humidity?
I don't know what you mean by the problem.
Didn't you testify, Mr. Durst, that the reason that you were opening and closing your door was because you were having trouble closing it because of the humidity? Isn't that what you testified to?
I remember it was hard to shut the door frequently because of the humidity in Galveston.
And in fact, you had the following exchange on cross-examination on October 27, 2003, page 87, lines 16 through 20. Question: is it just coincidence that after Mrs. Henriquez saw you, the door shut just perfectly? Answer: after Mrs. Henriquez saw me, I did the right thing to make the door stay shut. That was your testimony, correct?
Correct.
Now, you have testified that the next thing that you can recall doing was walking on the Galveston seawall. Is that correct?
Well, this is back to where you asked if during direct questioning I stated everything that I did. I must have done numerous things before walking on the seawall. The seawall is probably 3/4 of a mile or a mile from the apartment. So I must have crossed numerous streets.
You testified at Galveston that you, quote, walked all the way pretty much where the seawall ends on the east side. Is that correct? That's what you testified to in Galveston.
That's correct.
And during that walk, you also went to the Bank of America and withdrew $9,500, correct?
Bank of America was on the way.
And,
Correct.
and Mr. Durst, would you agree that that $9,500, that was part of a plan to structure money, correct?
I never had a plan to structure money.
It's about,
I did not.
it was a logical point, it's a break.
I'm sorry, Your Honor?
As logical.
Oh, yes, this, and whenever, Your Honor.
Then we will break. Ladies and gentlemen, Order 10 at 11. Do not converse among yourselves or with anyone else on any subject connected with this case. Do not form or express any opinion on the case.